Thank you for staying with us. We're doing our last part of the program with Dr. Joe Dispenza. And Joe, I asked you during the break, could you just talk a little bit on Alzheimer's and dementia and how this fits in? Because we've got a pretty ageing population. And
well, the latest research on Alzheimer's says if you want to prevent it, learn something new every day. I mean, you can't have Alzheimer's unless you begin to lose your declarative memories. You can't have Alzheimer's unless you start forgetting about things you learn and things you experience. And with Alzheimer's, that's the first memory system to go. It's called our declarative memory system. There's also research that shows that certain toxicities like mercury and heavy metals have an influence on gene activation to make the amyloid protein. There's also research that shows that head injuries, that if people have one strong head injury, they're 8 to 9 times more likely to have Alzheimer's from a head injury. And head injuries are the reason for many, many different types of brain conditions. And then there's just the people who carry the gene, and then they live a very stressful life, and they fall into routine. And I think it's the routine and the chemicals of stress that begin to turn on those genes that create disease. But just because you have the gene expression doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the condition. There's ways to prevent it, and there's certainly ways to slow the process down. The problem is that once it starts happening, then it's harder to begin to control. So if the person knows that they have a family history of it, then they have to get about staying out of routine, learning new things, having new experiences, crossword puzzles or reading books or playing chess or any of those things that keep the mind turned on. Certainly a great way to begin. And there's certainly a lot of nutritional supplementation now that's being correlated with the prevention of Alzheimer's.
Okay. Heart-mind connections.
Well, heart and mind, will and mind, there has to be a balance between head and heart. You see, the head is the thinking and the heart is the feeling. And there is this loop between thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking. And that's what creates what is called a state of being. So if people think sad thoughts or unhealthy thoughts, or if they think suffering thoughts, they begin to feel suffering. They begin to feel unhappy. And when that happens, those negative thoughts, I hate to use the word negative, but those self-depreciating or self-limiting thoughts tend to turn on the body's survival centers that have to do with feeling certain emotions. That's not a heartfelt experience, that's the survival experience. When we are truly in the state of heartfelt emotions, those emotions have to do with giving and altruism and love and expansion and inspiration. Those feelings are not associated with survival at all. We have survival and we have creation. And in the state of creation or creativity or expansion or flourishing or growth, the balance between head and heart then means that you're actually thinking a certain way and you're actually demonstrating what you're thinking. And when you have your body doing what your mind wants, that's when the heart is open. When head and heart are aligned, when mind and body are working together, that's when the heart tends to be open. So if people just took a few minutes and got in touch every day with the heartfelt emotion of joy, they would begin to think equal to how they feel. And I'm certain that a lot of conditions that have to do with the heart are from people who are from the attitude of shutting off the expression or the feeling of those emotions.
Okay, because you were also talking yesterday about doing the rehearsal first thing in the morning when we wake up and last thing at night before we go to sleep, because our brains are in a more receptive...
Well, the subconscious mind, the door to the subconscious mind is open when we wake up in the morning and we go to sleep at night. And if we're interested in programming the subconscious mind, the analytical mind is at its height in the middle of the day. You can't slow it down. It already is tapped in or connected to the environment. When you wake up in the morning and when you go to bed at night, your analytical mind is relatively well, it's not solidified. So when you wake up in the morning and you can't remember who you are and you're waking up, it's a good time to begin to rehearse because you can remember yourself as somebody else. When you go to bed at night, the analytical mind's too tired to actually analyze any longer, so the door between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind is open.
Okay. The difference between belief and will?
Well, our thoughts actually are they come from our memories. That when we learn something and we have experiences, but primarily our thoughts come from things that we're exposed to, and it usually it's related to learning. If we take a series of thoughts and we cluster them together, thought, we create what's called an attitude. An attitude is just a cluster of thoughts that have been lined up. If you take attitudes and you piece those attitudes together, now we're talking about beliefs. And if you then take beliefs and you chunk them together, now we're talking about perceptions. And perception then allows us to choose the relationships we have, the things we learn. Our perceptions are involved in everything that we do. And it is perception that gives us the permission to see the world as a beautiful place, or see the world as a harsh environment. And we make those states of perception based on how we chemically are experiencing internally the world and how we're wired. And so the neurochemical self is an accumulation of experiences and learning that creates attitudes, that creates beliefs, that creates perceptions.
Okay. Yesterday in the workshop you were talking about, we can have a mood. And if we stay in that mood long enough, that leads to, what was that next step?
A temperament.
A temperament, which if we stay there long enough leads to...
Personality trait. Yeah, so, the way it is that you have an emotional reaction. An emotional reaction has the release of chemicals. Those chemicals then have what's called the refractory period after those release of chemicals. Now, in the West, we think emotions are so real, but really they're just chemically based. And so a person has an emotional reaction. They feel angry, they feel frustrated, they feel sad. The ability to be able to shorten that refractory period is the ability to have a certain degree of emotional control. People who tend to keep that refractory period going for days or weeks, that turns into a mood. And the mood is just an extended emotional reaction that where we keep those chemicals going, which then turns into temperaments and ultimately personality traits.
And one of the things you were saying is we can just say the word stop.
Yeah, that's one of the mechanisms where we develop conscious control, and I do that all the time. I guess the question that I ask myself when I'm in an emotional reaction is I always ask myself the same question: is this loving to me? That's what I really ask. Is this chemistry? Knowing what those emotional reactions do to the brain and body, is this loving to me? And if I can really stop and ask that question and wait for a sincere answer, the answer is always no. No one or nothing is worth that emotional reaction. The initial emotional reaction is a very real thing. But the way in which we cope with that emotional reaction can be monitored by our own conscious will.
Okay. So much isn't there. The next book that you're writing is to do with what? Feeling, thinking, being.
Well, the next book's called Thinking, Doing, and Being, Manual for Change. Yeah. And there are 3 brain systems in place. In the book Evolve Your Brain, the first book that I wrote, the last chapter, chapter 12, is about the concept of thinking, doing, and being. And it was a hint to let people know that there are 3 brain systems in place, that we can actually create a state of being. And when we create a state of being, it means that we have trained the body to be the mind. Now, most of the time, people are being unhappy, or they're being unworthy, or they're being confused because they went from thinking to doing to being. They thought certain ways. They acted in congruence with those thoughts, and by repeating the same actions over and over again, they got all 3 brain systems going in place, and now that person's unhappy or they're suffering. And when that internal order has been consistent, there really isn't anything from their external environment that can move them from that state of unhappiness. You can try to rouse them, you can try to excite them, you can try to teach them, but really no new information is going to enter into the system. Well, because there's three brain systems in place, the neocortex, the feeling brain or the limbic brain, and the cerebellum, we could also train the mind and body to begin to think in new ways, apply what we learn, have a new experience, and if we're able to repeat that experience, we create a new state of being. So we could either choose to be in a state of suffering, or we can retrain the brain and the mind